I was on my knees in the dark, water up to my wrists. The planting beds I had spent months building were flooding, the stone channels overwhelmed, and behind me I could hear Dorothea Scarrett's voice breaking through the rain, calling a name I wasn't sure I wanted to answer anymore. They told me nothing grows in the dark. That night, with the cave filling and the woman who had kept my past from me standing somewhere above in the storm, I nearly believed them. But that was later. Let me start at the beginning. They told me I was nothing, that I came from nothing and would amount to nothing. And on the morning of March 14th, 1938, when Mrs. Hargrove read aloud the letter from a lawyer in Beckley, West Virginia, informing me that my dead mother's sister, a woman I had never met, had left me a sealed limestone cave and 12 acres of hollow land, every girl in the dormitory laughed, even the youngest ones, even the ones who usually cried themselves to sleep. They laughed because it was easier to laugh at me than to think about their own futures. Mrs. Hargrove, with her steel gray bun and her permanent expression of mild disgust, folded the letter, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Cora Everett, I suppose even the dead can play cruel jokes on the living." I was 16 years old. I had been at the Briarfield Home for Unwanted Girls since I was 9, when tuberculosis took my mother and my father simply vanished. Walked out the back door of our rented house in Charleston one Tuesday afternoon and never came back. No note, no explanation. Just an empty chair at the kitchen table and a coat still hanging by the door. 7 years I had lived among girls who were taught to sew, to clean, to keep their eyes down, and to be grateful for the cold oatmeal and the colder beds. 7 years I had stolen every book I could get my hands on. Science textbooks from the donation bins, old agricultural pamphlets from the church basement, a water-stained copy of the Practical Gardener's Almanac that I hid under my mattress like contraband. Mrs. Hargrove hated my reading. She called it vanity. She said girls who read too much got ideas, and ideas in a girl like me were as dangerous as matches in a hayloft. She wasn't entirely wrong about the danger, because the moment I heard the word sealed limestone cave, something lit up inside me. Not a match, a furnace. And I decided right then, standing in that drafty dormitory with 19 girls laughing at my inheritance, that I would leave Briarfield and I would never come back. That night, a girl named Pauline, the closest thing I had to a friend, sat on the edge of my bed and held out half a biscuit she'd saved from supper. "You don't have to go alone, Cora," she said. "I could write to you. I could send things." I looked at the biscuit. I looked at her hand. "I don't need anything from anyone," I said. Pauline pulled her hand back. She didn't say another word. She just climbed into her own bed and turned toward the wall. And I lay there in the dark, knowing I had hurt her and telling myself it didn't matter. That needing people was the first step toward being abandoned by them. That every hand held out would eventually pull away. That was my flaw. I know that now. I wore my pride like armor, and I called it strength. And I couldn't see the difference between protecting myself and destroying every bridge that someone tried to build toward me. But it was the lawyer's last sentence that stayed with me long after the laughter faded. Mr. Aldridge had written it in careful script at the bottom of the letter, almost as an afterthought. Miss Everett should know that her aunt, Mrs. Hazel Everett, left standing instructions with our office. She asked us to wait. If any person bearing the Everett name should come forward to claim the property, we were to deliver it without delay. She waited for this for many years. I read that line 4 times. Hazel Everett had never written to me, never visited, never sent so much as a birthday card through the Briarfield mail slot. But she had waited. She had told her lawyer to wait. As though she knew somehow that one day someone with her name would come. That someone was me. And I couldn't understand why. If you want to find out what I found inside that sealed cave in the mountains of West Virginia, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a suitcase of stolen books turned a hole in the ground into something that changed an entire valley, then stay with me. Because what I built in that darkness, what I grew where nothing was supposed to grow, is a story that still lives in those mountains today. I left 3 days later. Mrs. Hargrove didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved. I was the girl who asked questions nobody wanted to answer. Why didn't we learn mathematics past the 6th grade level? Why weren't we allowed to apply to the teachers' college in town? Why did the boys at the Briarfield Boys' Home get workshop training while we got sewing needles in silence? I was inconvenient. And now I was someone else's problem. Except there was no one else. Just me and a letter and a cave I'd never seen. The lawyer, Mr. Aldridge, was a thin man with kind eyes who met me at the bus station in Beckley. He drove me 30 miles into the mountains in a truck that rattled like it was dying. The road turned to dirt, then to mud, then to something that barely qualified as a path. We climbed through forests so thick the sunlight came through in coins, past abandoned coal camps and hollowed-out hillsides where the earth itself looked exhausted, until we reached a valley that opened up like a secret someone had kept for 1,000 years. Your Aunt Hazel lived here alone for 40 years, Mr. Aldridge told me, parking the truck beside a collapsed fence. She was particular. People in town thought she was strange. She studied things, plants, minerals, underground water systems. She wrote letters to universities that mostly went unanswered. He paused and looked at me the way people look at stray dogs, with pity and distance. When she died, nobody came to the funeral except me. He handed me a rusted key, pointed to the hillside, and drove away without looking back. The cabin was small, 1 story, built from hand-cut logs that had gone silver with age. The porch sagged on the left side, and the chimney leaned slightly east, as though the whole structure had been slowly exhaling for decades. But the windows were clean. I noticed that first, not the leaking roof or the cracked wood stove or the mice nests in the mattress. I noticed that someone had wiped the windows recently. The glass was still streaked where a damp cloth had been dragged across it. And on the kitchen table, in a chipped blue vase, sat 3 stems of fresh wildflowers, mountain laurel, still holding their color. The grass around the cabin had been cut within the last week. I could see the stubble, pale and even, against the darker growth at the tree line. And in the kitchen, behind the curtain that served as a pantry door, the shelves held flour, salt, a tin of coffee, and a jar of honey with a cloth lid. All of it recent. All of it placed there by hands that were not mine. Someone had prepared this house for me. Someone who knew I was coming before I did. That thought should have comforted me. Instead, it made the hair on my arms stand up. Because in my experience, people who did things for you always wanted something in return. Always. I set my suitcase on the floor. And that's when I heard the sound. A low whine, barely audible, coming from under the porch. I knelt down and looked into the gap between the floorboards and the dirt. 2 amber eyes stared back at me from the shadows. A dog. Old, gray around the muzzle, ribs showing through a coat that had once been copper red. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself for 7 years. The look of something that had been waiting so long it had forgotten what it was waiting for. I held out my hand. He crawled out slowly, his belly low to the ground, his tail tucked. And when he reached me, he pressed his nose into my palm and let out a sound that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a cry. Something in between. Something that meant I know you, even though we've never met. I called him Copper, for the faded color of his fur. Hazel's dog. The one thing she had owned that refused to leave. He followed me everywhere after that, as if he'd been given a job he had waited years to start. Copper led me around the property that first afternoon, trotting ahead on stiff legs and glancing back to make sure I followed. He took me to the creek where the water ran clear and cold over flat stones, to the old woodpile where a rusted axe still leaned against the splitting stump, to the chicken coop whose door hung open and empty, the straw inside still pressed flat where hens had once nested. And then he took me to the hillside. There, half hidden by rhododendron and wild grape, was a wooden door set into the rock face, framed by hand-cut limestone blocks that had been fitted together with a precision that made me stop breathing. This was not rough work. This was craft. This was someone who had spent years learning how stone wanted to fit together. The padlock was rusted but functional. The key fit. The door swung inward with a groan that echoed into blackness. I lit the kerosene lantern Mr. Aldridge had left me and stepped inside. And what I saw made me drop to my knees. Hazel had built an underground garden. Not a garden the way you might picture, with rows of vegetables and cheerful sunlight. This was something stranger and more beautiful. The cave's main chamber was roughly 60 feet wide and maybe 15 feet high at its peak. The natural limestone floor had been leveled and divided into raised beds made of stacked stone. Along the ceiling, Hazel had installed a series of angled mirrors. Actual glass mirrors, some cracked, some clouded with age, all mounted on wooden frames that caught the light from a narrow natural chimney near the entrance and bounced it deeper into the cave. During the hours when the sun hit that chimney at the right angle, the cave glowed with a soft, diffused light that reached all the way to the back wall. It was like standing inside a lantern, like being held inside something that was both dark and bright at the same time. And there was water. Hazel had built a series of stone channels that directed the cave's natural seepage into a collection pool and then through the raised beds. The limestone itself slowly released calcium and other minerals into the water, a natural fertilizer that required nothing but patience and gravity. The beds were empty now. Whatever Hazel had last grown had died or been harvested years before. But the infrastructure was there. The mirrors, the channels, the stone beds, the careful engineering of 40 years of one woman's life, standing silent in the dark, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. On a shelf carved into the cave wall, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, I found a leather-bound journal, thick as a Bible, held together with a strap. On the cover, in careful handwriting, it said, "Notes on the Cultivation of Life in Darkness. Hazel Everett, 1901 to 1937. I opened it to the first page. They will tell you that nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. The dark is where all seeds begin. I sat on that cave floor and cried, not from sadness, from the overwhelming recognition that someone like me, someone the world had called strange, Someone who studied and questioned and refused to accept the way things were, had come before me, had lived in this very place, had built something extraordinary out of nothing but knowledge and stubbornness and time. And she had waited for me, prepared a place, left instructions, as though the cave itself were a letter she had written over 4 decades, and I was the only person meant to read it. I didn't know why yet, but Copper pressed himself against my leg in the dark, and I held the journal to my chest, and for the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel alone. It was Copper who showed me the room. On the second morning, while I was trying to coax the cracked wood stove into cooperation, cursing under my breath and burning my fingers on a match that wouldn't hold, he pawed at a door in the hallway I had assumed was a closet. He scratched at it, whined, looked back at me. I opened it. The room was barely bigger than a pantry, but it wasn't a closet, and it wasn't storage. It was a child's study. A small wooden desk faced a window that looked out over the valley. On the wall, someone had hung a chart of the periodic table, hand-drawn in colored ink, each element labeled in neat, careful letters. The bookshelf held 12 volumes, botany primers, a children's encyclopedia of natural science, a field guide to Appalachian wildflowers with illustrations that someone had hand-tinted with watercolors, all of them chosen for a young reader, all of them placed there with intention, and on the doorframe, carved into the wood with a steady hand, was a single letter, E for Everett. The books were not dusty, the desk was not warped. The window had been cleaned as recently as the others. This room had been maintained. Year after year, someone had come in here and kept it ready. Wiped the desk, straightened the books, opened the window to let air in and closed it again before the rain. Hazel hadn't just left me a cave. She had built me a classroom. She had prepared a place for a child who loved science, who loved growing things, who asked too many questions and refused to stop asking them. She had been waiting for me since before I was born. I sat at that little desk. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood, and I cried so hard that Copper whined and pushed his wet nose under my arm, because no one had ever prepared a place for me, not once in 16 years. No one had ever looked at the empty space where I should have been and thought, she will come. I will make it ready. Until Hazel, a woman I never met. A woman who died waiting. A woman who had somehow loved me before I existed. That thought was almost too large to hold. The knock came that evening, just as the light was turning gold and the first bats were sweeping low over the creek. I opened the door to find a woman I guessed to be about 70. Small. Thin in the way mountain women got thin. Not from vanity, but from decades of carrying water and splitting wood and climbing slopes that would wind a person half her age. Her hands were rough and brown. Her eyes were sharp and wet. She held a pot of soup in both hands. The steam rose between us like a question. "My name is Dorothea Scarrett," she said, "but people here call me Dot. I live up the ridge about a half mile. I knew your aunt." She said that last part carefully. The way you handle something fragile. The way you set a cracked cup on a shelf. I took the soup because I was too hungry to refuse, which bothered me. I didn't like taking things from people. Taking things meant owing things, and owing things meant trusting people. And I had learned a long time ago what trusting people cost. "Thank you," I said. And waited for her to leave. She didn't leave. Instead, she stood on my porch and looked past me into the cabin with an expression I couldn't read. Her eyes moved from the kitchen table to the hallway to the open door of the little study, and something shifted in her face. A tremor, like a crack running through still water, like something she had held together for years was threatening to come apart. "She looks just like her," she whispered. I don't think she meant for me to hear it, but I did. "I'm sorry," I said. She blinked, straightened, smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nothing, child. Just an old woman talking to herself. You eat that soup while it's hot. I'll come check on you tomorrow." She turned and walked back up the ridge path, moving carefully in the fading light. Copper trotted beside her for 20 or 30 yards before stopping, looking back at me and returning to the porch. As though he were torn between two loyalties he couldn't explain. I watched Dorothea Scarrett disappear into the tree line, and I thought about the way she had said, "I knew your aunt." Not I knew of her, not I heard about her. I knew her. Present tense hidden inside past tense. Intimacy disguised as neighborliness. And I thought about the soup, still warm in my hands, and the clean windows, and the wildflowers on the table, and the flour and salt and honey in the pantry. Dot Scarrett had done all of that. I was certain of it now. She had been keeping this house alive for a dead woman, waiting for someone who might never come. That night, I sat on the porch with the soup warming my hands and Copper at my feet and Hazel's journal in my lap. The valley was dark, and the mountains were darker, and somewhere up the ridge, a single light burned in Dorothea Scarrett's window. I turned to the last page Hazel had written before she died. Most of it was technical. Notes about soil pH and light angles and the mineral content of limestone seepage. But at the very bottom, in handwriting that trembled slightly, as though the hand that wrote it was tired or cold or both, Hazel had written one final line. "She will come, and when she does, the dark will keep what I have planted until she is ready to grow." I closed the journal. I looked at the sealed cave on the hillside, its wooden door shut tight against the night. And I thought, who were you, Hazel Everett? What did you know about me that I don't know about myself? And what was Dorothea Scarrett so afraid to tell me? The mountains didn't answer. They never do. But Copper pressed closer against my leg, and the soup was warm. And the cabin, for all its cracks and leaks and sagging, held the night air out. Somewhere in the dark, in the cave I had not yet begun to understand, Hazel's mirrors waited for the sun. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The first week nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. I had arrived in late March, and the mountains of West Virginia don't care what the calendar says. Winter holds on with both hands up there. The cabin roof leaked in 4 places. The wood stove was cracked down one side, and the firewood I gathered from the forest floor was green and wet and refused to hold a flame. The second night, it snowed. Not a gentle dusting, but a real mountain snow, heavy and thick, the kind that bends trees and buries roads. I woke at 3 a.m. to water dripping on my face and the stove dead and cold. I lay there shaking so hard my teeth ached, and I thought, this is how I die. Not from cruelty, not from injustice, but from cold and silence and the absolute indifference of the mountains to one small girl's survival. I thought about going back. I thought about Mrs. Hargrove's oatmeal and the dormitory's thin warmth and the certainty of a life I understood, even if I hated it. I thought about the girls laughing and how warm their laughter had been compared to this cold. But then, as the gray dawn crept into the cabin, I dragged myself to the table and opened Hazel's journal by candlelight. and I read her notes about the cave's temperature. 55 degrees, year-round, stable, warm enough that nothing ever froze. The cave was warmer than my cabin. That morning, I carried my blanket into the cave and slept on the stone floor beside the empty planting beds, with Copper curled against my back. And for the first time since arriving, I slept without shaking. The cave kept its promises, even when nothing else did. I followed Hazel's journal like scripture. I repaired the mirror system first, replacing 2 shattered mirrors with polished tin sheets I made by cutting apart coffee cans and pounding them flat on a rock. Not as effective as glass, but they caught some light. I cleaned the water channels with my bare hands, pulling out years of sediment and dead leaves until the seepage flowed clear again. I tested the soil in the raised beds and found it dark and rich and alive with the organisms Hazel had cultivated over decades. I planted cold-tolerant crops first: lettuce, spinach, kale, turnips, radishes, things that could handle 55 degrees and partial light. And then I waited. The forest saved me while I waited. I ate ramps and dandelion greens and fiddlehead ferns pulled from the creek banks. I caught crawdads in the shallow water and cooked them over the wood stove on the nights I could get it lit. I found a patch of wild strawberries in a clearing and ate them so fast I made myself sick. I lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose. There were mornings I woke so dizzy I had to crawl to the water bucket. My hands blistered, my back ached, my knees were permanently bruised from kneeling on stone, but I didn't ask for help. Not once. Dot Scarrett came every day. She brought soup, bread, jars of preserved beans. She left them on the porch when I wasn't there, and handed them to me directly when I was. Each time, I took the food and said, "Thank you," and nothing else. Each time, she lingered a moment longer than necessary, watching me with those sharp, wet eyes, wanting to say something she couldn't bring herself to say. I didn't make it easy for her. I know that now. I kept my distance the way a dog that's been kicked keeps its distance. Polite enough to take the food, too proud to sit down and share it. That decision would cost me more than I knew. The first person from town who came to find me was Virgil Scarrett, Dot's husband, 73 years old, a retired coal miner who lived with Dot in their cabin up the ridge. He had a cough that came from deep inside his chest, the kind of cough that sounds like gravel being dragged across tin. Black lung, the mine's last gift to the men who had given them everything. He appeared at the cave entrance one morning in early April while I was on my knees cleaning the water channels. I hadn't heard him coming. When I looked up, he was standing in the doorway, with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted, studying the mirrors the way a man studies a piece of machinery he respects. "Hazel showed me once," he said. His voice was quiet and rough. "Must have been 1920. She had tomatoes growing in here in January. I thought I was dreaming." He stepped inside, looked at my repaired beds, my tin can mirrors, my cleared channels. He ran his hand along the stone wall and nodded slowly. "You're her," he said. "You're just like her." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Virgil became my teacher in the ways Hazel's journal couldn't be. He taught me how to split wood so the axe did the work instead of my arms, how to patch a roof with tar paper and cedar shakes, how to read weather in the clouds and the behavior of birds. When the wind smelled like iron, rain was coming. When the crows went quiet, something was wrong. He brought me tools from his shed: a proper shovel, a hand plow, a set of chisels for working limestone. And in return, I fed him. fresh greens from the cave, mushrooms I had started growing on fallen oak logs in the dark chamber at the back, following Hazel's instructions about a second room deeper in the cave where no light reached at all. "Best food I've eaten in 30 years, he said one evening, sitting on the cabin porch while the fireflies lit up the hollow like fallen stars. He was breathing hard. He was always breathing hard. "The mines took everything from me," he told me. "My lungs, my strength. Dot and I had a son once. He moved to Akron for factory work, doesn't write, doesn't visit. The mines took him too, in a different way. Took the kind of life where a son wants to come home." He looked at the cave entrance, the wooden door standing open in the evening light. "But this," he said, "this is a mine that gives instead of takes." I almost reached out and touched his hand. Almost. But I didn't. Because that was who I was then. A girl who could accept a shovel but not a kindness. Who could take instruction but not affection. Who had decided, somewhere in those 7 years at Briarfield, that love was just another word for a debt you couldn't repay. It was Virgil who told me I needed to go to town properly, not just to buy supplies, but to let people see me, to let them know I was staying. I didn't want to go. The hollow was enough. The cave was enough. Copper and the journal and the slow green miracle of things growing underground were enough. But Virgil was right. I needed seed stock I couldn't find in the wild. I needed nails and tar paper and a new axe handle. And whether I liked it or not, Sable Creek was the only place within walking distance that sold any of it. So on a Tuesday morning in mid-April, I walked 7 miles down the mountain to town. Sable Creek. Population maybe 300. A main street with a general store, a post office, a church with a white steeple, and a feed shop that doubled as a barber shop on Saturdays. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed before they reached the sidewalk. I was noticed. The general store was owned by a woman named Lenora Galt, 57 years old, wife of the church deacon, head of the Ladies' Auxiliary Committee, the kind of woman who organized the Christmas pageant and the summer pie auction and made sure the flower beds outside the post office were weeded every Thursday. She wasn't a cruel woman. I want to be clear about that. Lenora Galt had never raised her hand to anyone. She spoke softly and smiled often and brought casseroles to every funeral in the county. But she had a way of arranging the world around her into categories. People who belonged, people who didn't. Things that were proper, things that were not. And I was not. She looked up when I walked into the store. Her eyes moved over me the way a shopkeeper's eyes move over merchandise. Assessing value. Finding it lacking. "You must be the Everett girl," she said, "up in Blind Hollow." "Yes, ma'am." She set my items on the counter one by one. Seeds, nails, a ball of twine, a small sack of flour. "People in town talk," she said, making change. "They say Hazel Everett was a strange woman. Lived alone in that hollow for 40 years, doing Lord knows what in that cave." She glanced up. Now a girl from an orphanage shows up to take her place. She let that sentence sit between us like a stone. "I'm just here to buy supplies," I said. "Of course you are, dear." She smiled. "But you should know. This is a small community. We look after each other. We're careful about who we let in." She handed me my change. Her fingers didn't touch mine. I left the store with my supplies and a feeling in my chest like a door being quietly closed. Not slammed. Lenora Galt would never slam a door. She would simply make sure it was locked from the inside and smile at you through the glass. It was outside the feed shop that I saw him for the first time. He was replacing a fence post for the churchyard, working with one hand and a tool belt rigged with loops and hooks so he could hold things against his body while his remaining hand did the work. His left arm ended just below the elbow. A clean amputation. Mine accident, I would learn later. He was maybe 28, tall, quiet in the way that mountains are quiet. Not empty, but full of things that didn't need to be said. He saw me standing there with my parcels, and he set down his hammer. "You need help carrying those?" "No," I said. "Too fast, too sharp. I don't need help." He looked at me for a moment. Then he picked up his hammer and went back to work. No argument, no wounded pride. Just acceptance of a boundary I had drawn in the air between us. His name was Colton Bridger, and that was our first conversation. All of it. 9 words from him, 5 from me, and the sound of a hammer driving a nail into the silence I left behind. That was the decision I mentioned at the start, the one that would change everything. Not going to town. Not meeting Lenora Galt or Colton Bridger. The decision was smaller than that and larger than I understood at the time. It was the decision to refuse every hand that reached toward me, to carry everything alone, to mistake stubbornness for strength and solitude for safety. That decision had consequences. They were coming. I just couldn't see them yet. It was a week after that first trip to town that I came home to find something on the kitchen table that hadn't been there when I left. A tin box, small and rusted, sitting beside the blue vase as though it had always been there. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, edges soft with age. 2 women standing on the cabin porch. One was older, tall, with her sleeves rolled up and dirt on her hands. Hazel. I recognized her from the small portrait hanging in the hallway. The other was younger, much younger. She held a baby against her chest, and she was laughing. On the back, in pencil, Hazel and Helen, 1922. Helen, my mother's name. I turned the photograph over again, looked at the young woman's face, at the baby in her arms. And I understood 2 things at once. First, that Hazel was not some distant relation. She and my mother had stood on this very porch, close enough to touch, close enough to love. And second, that someone had placed this box here while I was in town. Someone who wanted me to see it. Someone who was telling me the truth in pieces, as though the whole truth was too heavy to deliver at once. I set the photograph on the shelf beside Hazel's portrait. 2 women, 2 faces, and somewhere in the space between them, the story of why I was here. 6 weeks after planting, I harvested my first lettuce from the cave. It was pale, lighter green than sun-grown lettuce, with leaves so tender they tore if you handled them roughly. But it was crisp and sweet and alive. I stood in that dim cave holding a head of lettuce I had grown underground in reflected light and limestone water, and I felt something I had never felt in my entire 16 years. I felt powerful. Not powerful over anyone. Powerful inside myself. Like something that had been locked in my chest since the day my mother died had finally found the key. I brought a basket of greens to Virgil and Dot that evening. Virgil ate the lettuce standing up, right there on his porch, the leaves crunching between his teeth. He closed his eyes. "She'd be proud," he said. "Hazel would be so proud." Dot said nothing. She just looked at me, holding that basket with dirt still under my fingernails and tears standing in her eyes that she wouldn't let fall. That first summer, I expanded. Hazel's journal described a technique she called thermal banking. The cave's back wall was solid limestone, and during the warmest months, it absorbed heat from the air that drifted in through the entrance. In winter, the rock slowly released that warmth, keeping the temperature from dropping below 50 degrees, even when it was 0 outside. She had built a second chamber deeper in the cave, connected to the first by a narrow passage, where she grew mushrooms and root vegetables that needed no light at all. I opened the passage to the second chamber. It was smaller, maybe 20 feet across, dark as the inside of a closed fist. I started mushroom logs using fallen oak from the hollow. I planted potatoes and parsnips in beds I built by hand. And in the main chamber, my mirror system was working well enough that I could grow not just greens, but herbs. Basil, thyme, oregano. They filled the cave with a scent so unexpected and so beautiful that sometimes I just stood there breathing, forgetting for a moment that I was underground. I set up a small stand beside the bridge over Sable Creek every Saturday morning. I arranged my harvest in baskets lined with clean cloth. Lettuce, kale, spinach, radishes, bundles of herbs tied with string. Hazel's journal had taught me that presentation matters, that people eat first with their eyes. At first, people were suspicious. They walked past without stopping. They looked at the winter greens like they were looking at a card trick. Unnatural, they whispered. Who grows lettuce in a cave? But hunger is patient, and curiosity is persistent. One by one, they stopped. They picked up a head of lettuce and turned it in their hands. They smelled the basil, and their eyes went soft with memory. They bought a little, then a little more. The children came first. Children are less afraid of strange things than their parents are. A boy of about 8 walked up to my stand one Saturday, pointed at the radishes and said, "Did those really grow inside a mountain?" I told him they did. He bought 3 with a nickel his mother had given him and ate them right there on the bridge, juice running down his chin, grinning. After that, his mother came, and her sister, and her neighbor. Colton Bridger bought herbs from me on the 3rd Saturday. He didn't say much. He counted out his coins with his one hand, carefully, and placed them on the cloth beside the basil. Then he looked at me and said, "The fence post I put in outside the church is leaning." I was thinking about what holds things up. Your cave, the way you use the stone. It's good engineering. That was it. He picked up his basil and walked away. But I thought about what he said for the rest of the day. Good engineering, not good for a girl, not good for an orphan. Good engineering. As if what I'd done deserved to be measured by what it was, not by who had done it. That was our second conversation, and it mattered more than I wanted it to. Colton came to the farm for the first time in early June. Virgil had mentioned that my mirror array needed work. 2 of the tin reflectors had warped in the humidity, and the light in the back third of the main chamber had dimmed to almost nothing. I didn't ask Colton to come. Virgil did. And when Colton showed up at the cave entrance with a toolbox rigged for one-handed work, I stood in his way. "I can fix it myself," I said. He looked past me into the cave. Then he looked at me. "I know you can," he said, "but it'll take you 3 days alone. I can help you finish in 1. He didn't push. He didn't argue. He just stood there with his toolbox and waited. I let him in. I didn't know why. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was about the lettuce, about the light, about efficiency. But something in the way he had said, "I know you can," had unlocked a door I didn't know was closed. Because no one had ever said that to me. Everyone either offered help because they thought I was weak, or they left me alone because they thought I was difficult. Colton Bridger was the first person who looked at me and saw someone capable who could still benefit from company. We worked side by side for 6 hours. He held mirrors while I adjusted angles. I mixed mortar while he set brackets into the stone. We barely spoke, but the silence between us wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are paying close attention to the same thing. When we finished, the light reached all the way to the back wall again. The cave glowed. Colton stood in that glow and looked around at the beds and the channels and the herbs reaching toward the reflected sun. And he said, quietly, almost to himself, "It's like she built a church in here. A church for growing things." He left before dark. I didn't thank him enough. I know that now. It was that same week that Dot taught me to cook. She appeared at my cabin one afternoon with a basket of dried spices and a look on her face that said she was not leaving until I learned how to make something besides creek water soup. "Your aunt had a recipe," she said. "She made it every autumn. Mushroom stew with wild thyme and creek onions. I'll show you." She moved through my kitchen like she'd been there 1,000 times, because she had. She was the one who'd kept this cabin breathing while Hazel's body went cold, and the years piled up like snow. She knew which drawer stuck, which burner ran hot, where the good knife was hidden behind the flour tin. As the stew simmered, filling the cabin with a smell so rich it made my eyes sting, I asked her something I'd been holding back for weeks. "Where did you learn this recipe, Dot?" She stirred the pot without looking up. "From an old friend." I opened Hazel's journal to a page I had marked. There, in Hazel's handwriting, was the same recipe. Mushroom stew, wild thyme, creek onions, word for word. Dot's hand stopped stirring. "She was more than a neighbor to you," I said. "Wasn't she?" Dot set the spoon down. She pressed both hands flat against the table as though she needed something solid to hold her up. "Hazel was my dearest friend," she said. "For 38 years. I loved her like a sister. And there are things I need to tell you about her. About your mother. About why you ended up in that place." She looked at me then, and I saw in her face the same expression she'd had the first night. The tremor. The crack in still water. But deeper now. Closer to breaking. "But not yet," she said. Her voice shook. "I'm not brave enough yet. Please give me time." I should have said yes. I should have reached across the table and taken her hand. I should have said, "Whenever you're ready." But I was 16, and I was angry, and I was afraid. And the only thing I knew how to do with fear was turn it into a wall. "You're hiding something," I said. "Everyone here is hiding something." Dot flinched. She picked up her basket. She walked to the door. "I'll come back when you're ready to listen the way your aunt would have listened," she said softly. "With patience." And she left me alone with a pot of stew, and the growing certainty that the people closest to me were keeping secrets that had something to do with why I had spent 7 years in a place where no one wanted me. It was Copper who found the letters. 3 days after Dot's visit, on a warm afternoon in late June, he led me to the old oak tree at the edge of the property. The tree was enormous, split halfway up by lightning sometime in the past. Copper dug at the base, pawing at the roots with an urgency I hadn't seen in him before. I knelt down and pulled away the loose soil. Beneath the roots, wedged into a hollow between two stones, was a tin box, rusted shut. I pried it open with a chisel. Inside were letters, 6 of them, written in Hazel's hand, addressed to V, the same initial, V for Virgil. The first letter was dated 1935. "Dear V, I am writing to ask you once more. You must tell Helen's girl the truth. She deserves to know where she comes from. She deserves to know what happened to her father. She deserves to know that she was not abandoned. She was stolen by silence, by cowardice, by the same men who took everything from this hollow and left nothing but dust. Tell her, Virgil, before it is too late, before I die, and the truth dies with me. Tell her. She deserves to know. I read that letter aloud. My voice broke on the word stolen. She was not abandoned. She was stolen. By silence. I read it again. And again. Each time the words hit harder, like stones thrown at glass. My father didn't vanish. Something happened to him. And Hazel knew. And Virgil knew. And Dot knew. And none of them had told me. I sat under that oak tree with Copper pressed against my side, and the letters in my lap, and the last of the afternoon light sliding down the mountain like something letting go. And I understood, for the first time, that the mystery of this hollow was not about a cave or a garden or a dead woman's mirrors. It was about me, about who I was, about what had been taken from me before I was old enough to remember, and someone in this valley had the answers. That evening, I went back to the cabin and opened Hazel's journal to the section about my mother. I had avoided those pages. They were personal in a way the technical notes were not. But now I turned to them with shaking hands. Half the pages were missing, torn out, cleanly, recently. The edges were sharp, not yellowed. Someone had removed them within the last few weeks. Someone who had access to the cabin. Someone who had been here before I arrived. Someone who had cleaned the windows and stocked the pantry and placed wildflowers on the table. I looked up the ridge toward Dot Scarrett's window. The light was on. It was always on. And I thought about an old woman standing on my porch with soup in her hands and tears in her eyes, saying she looks just like her. I thought about Virgil, who taught me to read the weather but couldn't meet my eyes when I mentioned my mother's name. I thought about 6 letters buried under an oak tree, begging someone to tell the truth. I was not angry yet. That would come later. What I felt in that moment was something worse than anger. It was the cold, familiar weight of understanding that the people who seemed to care about me were keeping something that belonged to me, my own story, my own past. The truth about why a girl named Cora Everett ended up in a home for unwanted children, while a woman named Hazel Everett died alone in a hollow, waiting for her. Dot came to check on me the next morning. I saw her coming up the path from my window. Her steps were slow. Her hands were empty. No soup this time, just herself and whatever she was carrying inside. She knocked. I opened the door. Her face was swollen. She had been crying. I held up the letters, and the color drained from Dorothea Scarrett's face like water from a cracked cup. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread in front of me and Copper on the floor beside my chair. And I read each one again by candlelight until the words blurred and the candle guttered and the dark closed in. And for the first time since I had arrived in Blind Hollow, I wanted to leave. Not because of the cold, not because of the hunger, not because of the hard work or the loneliness or the ache in my bones, because I had started to trust someone. And trust, in my experience, was just the first step on the road to finding out that the person you trusted had been lying to you all along. The mountains were quiet that night, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. And somewhere up the ridge, Dot Scarrett's light was still burning. Dot didn't try to explain. Not right away. She stood on my porch with the morning light behind her and the letters in my hand between us, and she didn't say a single word in her own defense. She just looked at them, at the rusted tin box I'd set on the railing, at Hazel's handwriting visible through the thin paper, and then she looked at me. "I think you'd better come inside," I said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a demand. And she knew the difference. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd taught me to make mushroom stew, the same table where Hazel had probably written those letters year after year, begging someone to tell the truth. Dot folded her hands in her lap and pressed them together so hard her knuckles went white. Copper lay down between us. He looked from her face to mine and back again, the way a child watches its parents before a storm. I set the letters on the table, 6 of them, fanned out like a hand of cards. "These are from Hazel," I said, written to Virgil. She was asking him to tell me something, about my mother, about my father, about what happened to me. Dot nodded, slowly. "I know what they say," she whispered. "I read them years ago." "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me what Hazel wanted me to know." Dot closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the woman sitting across from me was not the cheerful neighbor who brought soup and taught recipes. She was someone older, someone broken in places she had spent years learning how to hide. "Your Aunt Hazel was your mother's sister," she said. "Her real sister. Not a distant cousin. Not a relative by marriage. Helen was Hazel's younger sister by 11 years. Hazel practically raised her. When Helen married your father, Hazel gave them money from her savings to rent that house in Charleston. When you were born, Hazel came to see you. She held you. She said you had her eyes." Dot's voice was steady now, the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed a confession so many times it has worn smooth. "Your father didn't vanish, Cora. He died in the Whitmore mine collapse of 1929. 14 men went down that morning. 9 came out. Your father was not one of the 9. I felt the chair shift beneath me. Or maybe it was the floor. Or maybe it was the world. The Whitmore Mining Company told the families it was an accident, a natural collapse, unstable rock. But Virgil was on the rescue team. He went down into that mine 12 hours after the collapse, and he saw what really happened. The support timbers had been removed, pulled out and sold for lumber by the company foreman to cover a debt. The company knew the shaft was unsafe. They sent those men in anyway. Dot's hands were shaking now. She pressed them flat against the table. "Your mother tried to fight. Helen was fierce, like you. She wrote to the mining commission. She wrote to the governor. She went to the company office in Charleston and demanded an investigation. And the company sent men to her door, not to talk, to warn. They told her if she didn't stop, she would lose the house. Lose everything. They told her that no one in the valley would work again if she kept pushing." "She stopped," I said. Dot shook her head. "She didn't stop. She got sicker. The tuberculosis had been in her lungs for years, but the grief and the stress and the poverty broke what was left. She died in the spring of 1931. You were 9. I knew this part. I had lived this part. The hospital, the smell of bleach and lilac, my mother's hand, thin as paper, holding mine, and then not holding mine. But what I didn't know was what came next. Hazel came for you," Dot said, "the week after Helen died. She came down from the hollow and went straight to the Briarfield home and told Mrs. Hargrove she was your aunt, your mother's only living relative, and she wanted to take you home." The kitchen was very quiet. Even Copper had stopped breathing. Mrs. Hargrove said no, Dot continued. She said a single woman living alone in a cave in the mountains was not a suitable guardian for a child. She said Hazel was eccentric, unstable, that the home could provide better care. Dot swallowed hard, and she had a letter from a prominent member of the Sable Creek community, a woman who served on the church board and the county welfare committee. The letter confirmed Mrs. Hargrove's assessment. It said that Hazel Everett was, and I remember the exact words because Hazel repeated them to me so many times, a peculiar and solitary woman of questionable judgment, unfit to raise a child. Who wrote the letter? I asked, but I already knew. Somewhere in the part of me that had been watching and listening and putting pieces together since the day I arrived, I already knew. Lenora Galt, Dot said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Lenora Galt, the woman at the general store, the woman who had smiled at me and called me dear and told me that this was a small community that was careful about who it let in. She had written a letter that kept me in an orphanage for 7 years. Why? I said. Dot shook her head. Lenora was afraid. Hazel had been writing to the mining commission too. She had evidence about the Whitmore collapse. She was gathering testimony. Lenora's husband was the church deacon, but he also kept the books for the mining company. If Hazel's investigation succeeded, the Galts would have been ruined. So Lenora wrote the letter, and Hazel was turned away. I sat with that. I sat with it the way you sit with a burn, feeling it spread, feeling it reach the places you thought were safe. And you, I said, you and Virgil, you knew all of this. Dot's face crumpled, not dramatically, not with a sound. It just fell in on itself, the way a house collapses when the last beam gives way. We knew, she said. Virgil was in that mine. He saw the missing timbers. He could have testified, but the company told him if he spoke, they would shut down every mine in the valley. 100 families would lose their income. He was afraid, Cora. He was a coward, and he knew it, and it ate him alive for 20 years. She pressed her hands against her eyes. And I was worse, she said, because I wasn't afraid. I was ashamed. I was Hazel's closest friend. She begged me to speak up. She begged me to go to Briarfield and tell them the truth about her, that she was capable and kind, and that she loved you. And I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself you'd be fine. I told myself the orphanage was better than a cave in the mountains. Her voice broke. And every year I watched Hazel prepare that little room for you. Every year she put new books on the shelf and cleaned the desk and carved that letter into the doorframe. And every year I knew that you were in that place because I had been too weak to stand up for the woman who would have loved you. The silence after she finished was the loudest silence I have ever known. I looked at Dorothea Scarrett, this old woman who had brought me soup on my first night, who had kept Hazel's house alive for years, who had put flowers on the table and flour in the pantry and cleaned the windows so that when I arrived, the cabin would feel like someone cared. She had cared. She had cared enormously, but caring and courage are not the same thing. And the distance between them had cost me 7 years. I stood up. You knew I was in that orphanage, I said. My voice was very quiet, very flat, the voice of someone trying very hard not to scream. You knew I was sleeping on a cot in a room with 19 other girls. You knew I was eating cold oatmeal and being told I was nothing. You knew, Dot, for 7 years. And you didn't come. Dot didn't look up. She couldn't. "Get out," I said. She stood. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "Hazel forgave me," she whispered, "before she died. She said she understood." "I don't care what Hazel did," I said. "I'm not Hazel." The door closed behind her, and I stood alone in the kitchen with 6 letters and a journal full of torn-out pages and a feeling in my chest like someone had reached inside me and pulled out something I needed to live, because I had trusted her, despite everything I knew about trust, despite every lesson Briarfield had taught me. I had started to let Dot in. I had started to think maybe this time would be different. Maybe this old woman with her soup and her recipes and her sharp, wet eyes was the first person in my life who didn't have a secret, who didn't want something, who was simply, purely kind. And she wasn't. She was kind, but she was also guilty, and kindness built on guilt is a house with no foundation. Copper went after her. I watched him from the window, trotting up the ridge path behind Dot with his tail low, looking back at me every few steps. Torn, loyal to both of us and unable to choose. I let him go. I didn't have the energy to call him back. That night, I sat on the cabin floor with my back against the wall, and I read Hazel's journal from the beginning. Not the technical sections, the personal ones. The ones I'd been avoiding. And on a page near the middle, written in an ink that had faded from black to gray, I found this: "I have forgiven Dot. Not because she deserves it. Perhaps she does. Perhaps she doesn't. I have forgiven her because she was afraid. And fear is not a sin. Silence is the sin." But Dot's silence came from the same place as her love. She was afraid of losing everything, and in her fear, she lost the one thing that mattered. I understand that now. I have been afraid too. I was afraid to push harder. Afraid to go to Briarfield a second time. Afraid that if I fought louder, they would make things worse for the child. We were all afraid. And the child paid the price. I closed the journal. I pressed my face against my knees, and I thought about the word forgiven. How easy it was for Hazel to write. How impossible it was for me to feel. The next 3 days were the worst of my life. Worse than Briarfield. Worse than the first freezing night in the cabin. Because at Briarfield, I had expected nothing. I had built my walls and lived inside them, and the cold was familiar. But here, in this hollow, I had started to let the walls come down. I had let Dot bring me soup. I had let Virgil teach me things. I had let Copper sleep at my feet. I had even let Colton Bridger stand in my cave and help me fix mirrors. And now the walls were gone, and I was exposed, and everything hurt. I didn't eat. I didn't work in the cave. I didn't go to town. I sat in the cabin and read Hazel's letters over and over, as if reading them enough times would change what they said. On the second day, Colton came. I saw him from the window, walking up the hollow path with his toolbox in his one hand. He knocked on the door. "Cora," he said, "Virgil told me you found some letters. He said you're upset. He said maybe you could use some company." I pressed my forehead against the door and said nothing. He waited a long time. Then he set something on the porch and left. When I opened the door, there was a small jar of honey with a note written in careful, blunt handwriting. It said, "You don't have to talk. You don't have to let anyone in. But you should eat something." I took the honey inside. I ate it with a spoon, sitting on the floor. And I hated myself for being grateful. On the third morning, I woke to a sound I hadn't heard before. Silence. Complete silence. No birdsong, no wind, no creak. I opened the door, and the sky was green. Mountain people know what a green sky means. It means a storm is coming that doesn't care about your plans, that doesn't negotiate, that simply arrives and takes what it wants. The wind hit an hour later. Then the rain. Not rain like I'd known it before. This was rain that fell sideways, rain that had weight and intention, rain that sounded like a freight train dragging itself across the roof. The creek rose. It rose fast. Within 2 hours, it had jumped its banks and was running through the lower part of the property. Water poured into the cave entrance. I ran down the hillside in the driving rain and found the main chamber ankle deep, the water channels overwhelmed, the planting beds flooding. My lettuce, my spinach, my kale. The herbs I had nursed for months. All of it drowning. I worked alone for an hour, trying to redirect the water, building mud barriers, digging drainage channels with my bare hands. It wasn't enough. The water kept coming. And then I heard something else through the rain. A voice, faint and broken by the wind. It came from up the ridge. Dot. She was calling for help. I stopped digging. I stood in the rain with mud to my elbows and water pouring into the cave behind me, and I had a choice to make. The cave, or the woman. My harvest, or the person who had betrayed me. The thing I had built with my own hands, or the woman who had let me down. I thought about Hazel's words. We were all afraid, and the child paid the price. I thought about Briarfield, about the cold oatmeal, about the 7 years, and then I dropped the shovel and ran. I found Dot halfway up the ridge path. She had fallen. Her ankle was twisted under her at an angle that made my stomach turn. The rain had soaked her to the skin, and she was shivering so hard she couldn't speak. "Virgil," she managed. "He's in the cabin. He can't breathe. The storm—" He was trying to close the shutters. He collapsed. I pulled Dot to her feet. She screamed when she put weight on the ankle, but she held on to me, and we climbed. Step by step, the mud sliding under our feet, the rain blinding. Copper appeared from somewhere and ran ahead of us, barking. Virgil was on the cabin floor beside the open window, rain pouring in over him. His face was gray. His chest made a sound like wet paper tearing with every breath. I dragged him away from the window. I shut the shutters. I built a fire in the stove with hands so cold I could barely feel the matches. I wrapped him in every blanket I could find, and I sat beside him and I held his hand. His eyes found mine, focused, cleared. "You came?" he said. "Of course I came." He coughed, blood on his lips. He looked at me with those eyes that had seen 50 years of darkness underground, and he spoke carefully, as though he was measuring each word against the breaths he had left. "You're like her," he said, "like Hazel. She was angry too, angry for years, at me, at Dot, at Lenora, at the whole damn valley. But she forgave us, not because we earned it, because carrying it was heavier than letting it go." He reached under his pillow. His hand was trembling. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax. "I wrote this 2 years ago," he said, "when the doctor told me the lungs were almost gone. It's everything. The truth about the mine. The truth about your father. The names. The dates. I had it notarized in Beckley. It's legal. It's real." He pressed it into my hand. "I was too afraid to speak when it mattered," he said, "but I could still write. Hazel taught me that. She said the written word outlasts cowardice. She was right about most things." He closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, evened, found a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Virgil Scarrett died 3 days later. On a Thursday afternoon, in his chair by the fire, with a bowl of my mushroom soup still warm on the table beside him. Dot was in the next room, her ankle wrapped in cloth, sleeping. Copper was at Virgil's feet. I was holding his hand. He went quietly, the way a candle goes when there's no wind, just smaller and smaller, and then not there. I sat with him for a long time. I didn't let go of his hand, because he was the man who had taught me to split wood and read the weather, the man who had brought me tools and eaten my lettuce standing up on his porch with his eyes closed, the man who had carried a terrible secret for 20 years and had tried, in the only way he knew how, to make it right before the end. He was the closest thing I had ever had to a grandfather, and I hadn't told him that, because I didn't know how to say things like that, because I was the girl who refused half a biscuit from Pauline in the dormitory, because I kept the world at arm's length and called it survival. I buried him on the ridge under the big oak tree, the one where Copper had found the letters. I dug the grave myself. It took all day. When I was done, I planted rosemary on the turned earth because Hazel's journal said rosemary was for remembrance, and I wanted the mountain to remember Virgil Scarrett. Then I went back to the cabin and opened the envelope he had given me, and I read the truth, all of it, every name, every date, every detail of the Whitmore mine collapse and the company's cover-up and the threats against my mother and the letter Lenora Galt had written to keep Hazel from taking me home. I set the envelope on the table. I looked at Dot, asleep in her chair with her wrapped ankle propped on a stool, and I heard a knock at the door. Lenora Galt stood on my porch, dry and pressed and perfect, as though the storm had never touched her. She held a folded document in her hands. "I've come to inform you," she said, "that I have written to the county welfare office. A girl of 16, living alone on an unregistered property, with no legal guardian, is in violation of state welfare codes. The county will be sending a representative within the week to assess the situation." She looked past me into the cabin, saw Dot, saw the blankets, saw the evidence of crisis. "If you cannot demonstrate legal right to this property and suitable living conditions," she continued, "the county will have no choice but to return you to the care of the state." She smiled, that same careful, locked door smile. "I'm only thinking of your welfare, dear," she said. "A girl your age shouldn't be living like this. It isn't proper." She turned and walked back down the path. Her shoes didn't have a single spot of mud on them. I stood in the doorway and watched her go, and I understood something that hit me so hard I had to grab the door frame to stay standing. She had done this before. She had written a letter to keep Hazel from taking me, and now she was writing to the county to take me from Hazel's home. The same woman, the same weapon, paper and authority and the quiet violence of a system that listens to the loudest voice in the room. History was repeating itself, and I was standing in the exact same place my aunt had stood 20 years ago, watching the same woman walk away, and feeling the same helpless fury that must have burned in Hazel's chest when they told her she couldn't have the child she loved. But I was not Hazel, and I was not helpless, and I was not going back to Briarfield. I closed the door, I sat down at the table, and I opened Virgil's envelope again, because Lenora Galt had made a mistake. She thought she was dealing with a strange girl from an orphanage who had no one and nothing, and would fold under pressure the way people always had in this valley, the way the miners' families had folded, the way my mother had been forced to fold, the way Dot and Virgil and even Hazel, in the end, had folded. But I had something none of them had. I had the written truth. I had Virgil's testimony. I had Hazel's journal. I had a cave full of food that half the families in Sable Creek depended on. And I had the stubbornness of a girl who had been told she was nothing so many times that she had decided to become something just to prove them wrong. The storm had passed. The creek was settling back into its banks. The sky was clearing from the west, the way it does in the mountains, one shade of blue at a time. I looked at Dot, still sleeping. I looked at Copper, lying at my feet. I looked at the cave on the hillside, its door hanging open, its beds flooded, its mirrors dark. Everything I had built was damaged, but damage and destruction are not the same thing. Hazel had taught me that. The cave had taught me that. You can flood a garden and the roots will hold, if the roots are deep enough. Mine were deep enough. I picked up the shovel, I walked out the door, and I went to save my cave. The county representative arrived on a Monday, a thin man in a brown suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He sat in the front pew of the Sable Creek Community Church with a clipboard on his knee and a fountain pen that he kept clicking open and closed like a nervous habit. Lenora Galt sat 3 rows behind him, pressed and polished, hands folded in her lap. The picture of civic concern. Half the town had come. I hadn't expected that. I thought it would be me and Lenora and a man with a clipboard and a decision already made, but the pews were full. Farmers in clean overalls, mothers with children on their laps, old men who leaned on canes and squinted in the light from the tall windows. They had come to watch. I didn't know yet whose side they were on. I walked to the front of the church, carrying a leather satchel that held everything I had. Hazel's journal, the letters from under the oak tree, Virgil's notarized testimony, and the original deed and inheritance documents that Dot had brought to my cabin 2 days earlier. She had limped down the ridge on her bad ankle, carrying a tin box I had never seen. Inside were the legal papers Hazel had entrusted to her years ago, the deed to the property, the will, notarized and witnessed, a letter from Mr. Aldridge confirming the chain of inheritance. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Dot had said, setting the box on my table. "I'm asking you to take what's yours." I hadn't answered her. I took the box and closed the door, but I didn't lock it this time, and I think she noticed. Now I stood in front of the county representative and opened the satchel. I laid out the deed first, then the will, then Mr. Aldridge's letter of confirmation. The paperwork was clean and legal and undeniable. Hazel Everett had left her property to any surviving member of the Everett family. I was the surviving member. The land was mine. The representative studied the documents. He clicked his pen. He nodded slowly. "These appear to be in order," he said. Lenora stood up. "The question isn't whether the paperwork is valid," she said. Her voice was calm and measured, the voice of a woman accustomed to being listened to. "The question is whether a 16-year-old girl, an orphan with no family and no guardian, should be living alone on a remote property. It isn't safe. It isn't proper. The county has a responsibility." She looked at me with an expression of practiced compassion. "I'm only thinking of the child's well-being," she said. And that was when I could have destroyed her. I had Virgil's testimony in my hand, every word of it. The missing mine timbers, the company cover-up, the threats against my mother, and the letter Lenora Galt had written to Mrs. Hargrove, the letter that called Hazel Everett unfit, the letter that kept me in an orphanage for 7 years while my aunt died alone waiting for me. I could have read it aloud. Every sentence, I could have watched Lenora's careful composure crack open in front of the entire town. I could have made her feel, for one burning moment, what it felt like to have your life decided by someone else's fear. I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. But I didn't. Because I had spent the last 2 nights reading Hazel's journal. Not the science, not the techniques. The parts where she wrote about anger, about what it costs to carry it, about how revenge and justice look the same from a distance but taste completely different up close. Anger is a fast fire, Hazel had written. It burns everything, including the person holding the match. So instead of reading Virgil's testimony, I opened the journal to a page I had marked with a dried sprig of thyme, and I read Hazel's words. I did not build this cave for myself. I built it for the valley, for the children who go hungry in winter, for the families who survive on canned goods and salt pork from November to March, for the miners' wives who watch their husbands come home coughing and know there is nothing green or growing to set before them. I built this cave because I believe that a woman alone in the mountains can do something that matters. And I believe that one day someone will come who carries this work forward, not for profit, not for pride, for the simple reason that people are hungry and the dark is full of seeds. I closed the journal. I looked at the county representative. I have been on that property for 4 months, I said. In that time, I have restored a cave farming system that produces fresh food year-round. I sell greens and herbs at the Saturday market. I have never missed a week. I have never cheated anyone. I have never asked for anything that wasn't earned. I turned to the pews, to the mothers and the farmers and the old men with their canes. Some of you have bought my lettuce, I said. Some of you have fed it to your children. You know what it tastes like. You know it's real. You know that the food I grow in that cave is the only fresh produce available in this valley from November to March. I looked at Lenora. I didn't come here to take anything from anyone, I said. My aunt built that cave to give, and I intend to keep giving. That's all I have to say. The room was quiet. The representative clicked his pen. And then a woman in the 4th row stood up. I recognized her. She had bought kale from me 3 weeks ago. Her son was the boy who had eaten radishes on the bridge. That girl fed my children, she said. When I couldn't afford the store prices, she gave me greens for free. Didn't ask for anything. Just put them in my basket and told me to come back next week. She sat down. A man in overalls stood. Then another woman. Then an old farmer I had never spoken to, but who had watched me from across the road every Saturday morning. One by one they spoke. Not long speeches, just facts. She fed us. She's honest. She works harder than anyone I've seen. The food is good. The girl belongs here. Lenora sat very still. Her hands were still folded, but something behind her eyes was shifting. Not anger, something closer to recognition. The slow understanding that the world she had arranged so carefully was rearranging itself without her permission. The representative closed his clipboard. The property documentation is legitimate, he said, and it appears the young lady has substantial community support. He looked at Lenora. I see no grounds for removal. I stood, shook my hand, and walked out of the church. Lenora left without speaking to anyone. She walked past me with her chin up and her eyes straight ahead, and her shoes clicking on the wooden floor. But at the door, she paused, just for a moment, and I saw her hand tighten on the frame. She didn't look back, but she had heard. She had heard every word. I found Dot outside the church. She was sitting on the stone wall by the cemetery gate, her bad ankle stretched out in front of her, Copper lying at her feet. She had come all the way down the mountain, 3 miles on a twisted ankle, to be there in case I needed her. She hadn't come inside. She told me later she didn't think she had the right. I sat down beside her. The afternoon sun was warm on the stone. The church bell tower threw a long shadow across the grass. Somewhere inside, people were still talking, but out here it was quiet. I didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did she. Then I reached into the satchel and pulled out Virgil's testimony. I held it out to her. I didn't read this in there, I said. I could have, but I didn't. Dot looked at the envelope. Her eyes filled. Why not? She whispered. Because Hazel wouldn't have, I said, and because destroying Lenora wouldn't give me back the 7 years. Nothing will give me back those years, Dot. Nothing you do, nothing you say. They're gone. Dot pressed her hands to her face. Her shoulders shook. But you kept the house, I said. You kept Copper alive. You put flowers on the table and books on the shelf and food in the pantry. You did that for years, not because anyone asked you to, because you loved Hazel and you were trying to make it right. I looked at her. This old woman with her swollen ankle and her shaking hands and her decades of guilt sitting on her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. I'm not ready to forgive you, I said. Not yet. I'm not there. But I'm not sending you away either. You came down a mountain on a broken ankle to sit outside a church in case I needed you. That means something. I don't know what yet, but it means something. Dot lowered her hands, looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she didn't try to hide what was in her eyes. Your aunt was right about you, she said. She said you'd be angry. She said you'd be stubborn. And she said you'd be kind, even when it cost you. Because that's what Everett women are. We're angry, and we're kind, and we don't know how to be one without the other. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Old, yellowed, sealed with wax that had cracked but held. Hazel gave this to me the week before she died, Dot said. She told me not to open it. She told me to give it to the girl when she was ready. I think you're ready now. I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Hazel's handwriting, shaking but clear. My dearest girl, I do not know your name. I do not know if you will ever read this, but I know you exist because your mother existed, and because the Everett blood does not stop flowing just because the world tries to dam it up. I went to Briarfield twice. The first time, they turned me away with a letter. The second time, they turned me away with silence. I stood outside that building and I looked up at the windows and I thought, she is in there, my sister's child, and I cannot reach her. I came home. I repaired the mirrors. I expanded the planting beds. I organized the journal. I built a desk by the window and filled a bookshelf with everything I wished someone had given me when I was young and curious and alone. I have done everything I can. The cave will wait for you. The seeds will keep. The dark will hold what I have planted until you are ready to grow. And when you come, and you will come, I want you to know this. You were not abandoned. You were not forgotten. You were loved fiercely, and from a great distance, by a woman who spent her last years preparing a world for you. Forgive the ones who failed you, not for their sake, for yours. Because carrying anger is like carrying stones uphill. It exhausts you, and you never reach the top. The dark is where all seeds begin. Come home. I folded the letter. I pressed it against my chest. And I sat on that stone wall beside Dorothea Scarrett, and I cried in a way I had not cried since my mother died. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it doesn't have a name. The crying of a girl who had been loved her whole life and never knew it. Dot put her arm around me. I let her. Copper laid his head across my feet. And somewhere up in Blind Hollow, in a cave carved into the side of a mountain, Hazel's mirrors caught the last of the afternoon sun and sent it spinning into the dark. The first thing I did when I got back to the farm was save the cave. The flood had done damage, but not destruction. 3 raised beds silted over, water channels clogged with mud, 2 mirrors cracked on the stone floor. The mushroom chamber ankle deep in standing water, but the walls held, the limestone held. The bones of what Hazel had built over 40 years were still standing. I worked for 3 days straight, on my hands and knees clearing channels, rebuilding beds stone by stone, rehinging mirrors with wire and leather strips. I replanted everything: lettuce, kale, spinach, radishes, new mushroom logs from fallen oak, herb cuttings into fresh soil. On the second day, Colton showed up. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He just appeared at the cave entrance with his toolbox and started working on the brackets I couldn't reach. We didn't speak for 2 hours, just hammers and chisels and water dripping. When we stopped to eat, sitting on overturned buckets, he told me something I wasn't expecting. I lost my hand in the Whitmore mine, he said. Not the collapse your father died in. A different accident. 2 years later. Same company. Same rotten timbers. He looked at his stump. Flexed muscles that still thought there was a hand to move. I was 20, he said. Thought my life was over. Turns out a man with 1 hand who refuses to quit is worth more than a man with 2 who never tries. He looked at me, and I saw that what I had mistaken for quietness was patience. The patience of someone who had rebuilt himself from something broken. We were not there yet, him and me. I was 16 and he was 28, and he was careful with fragile things. Whatever grew between us would take years, not weeks. But I thought about what he said for a long time. And I thought about how strange it was that in a valley full of people damaged by the same company, the same greed, the same silence, we had all ended up circling around a cave where a woman had figured out how to grow things in the dark. A week after the hearing, I found a burlap sack on my porch. No note. 20 pounds of seed potatoes and dried beans starts tied with kitchen string. A double loop with the ends tucked under. Lenora Galt's knot. I knew it from the packages she tied at her store. She never said a word about it. But the following Saturday, she came to my stand by the bridge, stood in line, bought kale and lettuce, counted out her coins on the cloth like everyone else. "That's good lettuce," she said. "Thank you," I said. She came back the next Saturday, and the one after. And slowly, without either of us naming it, the wall between us became something you could step across if you chose to. She never apologized in words. She apologized in seed potatoes and Saturday mornings. Not enough. Never enough, but something. Dot moved into the cabin that winter, not because I asked, because the ridge was too steep for her ankle and her cabin was too cold for a woman of 70 alone. I told myself it was practical. She cooked. I farmed. We divided the work the way 2 people do when they've stopped pretending they don't need each other. One December night, the first hard freeze, I came in from the cave and found Dot by the stove with 2 cups of mint tea. She handed me one. "Can I tell you something about your mother?" she said. I nodded. Helen used to sit in this exact chair when she visited Hazel. She'd drink tea and talk about the baby she was carrying. She said she wanted you to grow up curious. She said the world needed more women who wouldn't shut up. Dot smiled. The first real smile I had seen from her. "She'd have been proud of you, child." I reached across the table and took Dot's hand. The first time I had touched her voluntarily. Her hand was rough and warm, and it trembled slightly. That was the night she called me granddaughter for the first time. It slipped out. She was talking about spring planting, and she said, "Your grandmother, your aunt, she always started the spinach early." I didn't correct her. The war changed everything. When the young men left, the women and old men struggled to feed themselves. Rationing turned pantries into vaults. Gardens withered in the drought of 1943. My cave kept producing 55 degrees year-round. Indifferent to drought and frost and wartime, I lowered my prices. When families couldn't pay, I gave food away, loaded baskets and carried them to doorsteps where pride would have kept people from asking. "You're feeding the same people who would have let you starve," Dot said. "I know. That's why it matters." Colton and I married in the autumn of 1943. I was 21. He was 33. We married on the ridge above Virgil's grave, under the oak tree. Dot stood as my witness. We expanded the cave together. A 3rd chamber with improved ventilation and headlight reflectors for mirrors. Warm enough for tomatoes in winter. We took in apprentices, young people from the hollows who had nowhere else to go. The same kind of children I had been. Ruth Calloway helped me write a book on cave farming. 2 professors from West Virginia University drove out to see it and left shaking their heads. "Why doesn't anyone know about this?" one of them asked. "Because it was built by a woman no one listened to," I said, "and inherited by a girl no one wanted." Mrs. Hargrove came in the spring of 1946. She arrived in a car I didn't recognize, wearing city clothes that were entirely wrong for the mud. She stood in my hollow and looked at the terraces and the cabin and the cave entrance standing open, and she put her hand over her mouth. She had aged badly. The steel in her had gone to rust. "I came to apologize," she said. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. "I read about you in the university bulletin, about the cave farm, about what you're doing here." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Hazel wrote to me once," she said, "years ago, before you came to Briarfield. She asked if there were any girls in our care who loved science, who loved growing things. She wanted to pass on her work." Mrs. Hargrove's hands shook. I threw the letter away. I thought she was a foolish old woman. I thought girls didn't need science. I invited her inside, made tea from my own dried mint, gave her bread I had baked that morning. "I forgive you," I said, "not because you earned it, because I deserve to set it down." I sent her home with a basket of food. Dot passed in the autumn of that same year, quietly in her chair by the stove, mint tea still warm beside her. Copper lay at her feet. I think he knew before I did. I buried her next to Virgil on the ridge, planted rosemary on her grave, because she was worth remembering. All of her. The cowardice and the courage, the silence and the soup. On a Tuesday afternoon in late October, with the mountains burning red and gold, I walked to the small cemetery behind the church where Hazel Everett was buried. I knelt in the grass. Copper lay beside me, his muzzle white now. I placed a jar of cave-grown herbs on the headstone. Basil and thyme and rosemary. I found your cave, I said. I read your journal. I fixed your mirrors. I grew lettuce in the dark, just like you taught me. I fed the valley. I took in the children nobody wanted. I married a good man, and I buried good people, and I built something that will outlast me, the same way yours outlasted you. I touched the cold stone. You waited for me. You prepared a room and filled it with books and carved my initial into the doorframe. You went to Briarfield twice, and they turned you away twice, and you came home and kept working. You left me everything. The cave, the journal, the seeds, and the dark that holds things until they're ready. I'm home now, I said, and you were right. The dark is where all seeds begin. The mountains were quiet. The light was gold. The wind carried the smell of apples and turned earth. And somewhere inside the mountain, Hazel's mirrors caught the evening light and held it. The way they always had. The way they always would. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own sealed caves and the people who prepared a place for you before you knew you needed one, I'd love to hear about it. Have you ever received a letter that changed everything? Tell me in the comments. And remember, the people who told you nothing could grow in the dark were the ones who never bothered to plant anything. Your cave is waiting. Open the door